How would you decide where to retire? Nearness to family? A great climate? Lower taxes? A world-class healthcare system? Lots to do? And what about someone with fewer resources, living on only some Social Security income? Where in the world literally could you live comfortably for less than, say, $2,000 a month? Stay tuned as the RLS boys discuss all that and more right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. I'm your co-host, Roshan Loungani, here as always with Adrian Nicholson and Erik Olson. We've got a great episode for you today. Erik's back in town. We tried to record from the hotel last week, as we said, and it didn't work. Erik, good to see you back at home.
Thank you. Good to be back.
He did come back with some great ideas for us, which we hope will improve the podcast from the conference. So we're looking forward to that. And we've got an interesting episode today that I'll have to admit, in preparing for, I thought it would be a lot easier than it was. What we're going to discuss today are places to retire and really how you can select that. So Adrian, Erik, and I all went on a quest to figure out, okay, where would we retire? And we're going to tell you about the steps we took to figure out where and where we ended up choosing. And I know, for at least for me, I'm not happy with my decision because I don't feel comfortable with it. And but maybe things will change over the next 20 years when it is my turn to actually retire. But I've said before, I don't know that I'd ever actually retire. So this might just be for fun. So Erik, tell us, how was your trip back? How was the conference? Did you feel safe flying? Give us a little bit of an update on that.
Well, first of all, the conference was great. This, for our listeners, this was the Podcast Movement Conference, which is an annual gathering of podcasters from all sorts of different disciplines, and it was amazing what I learned there. So that was great. But actually, I drove each way. This was to Nashville because I just was looking at the number of hours that I'd spend in airports and in the TSA lines and such. And I just thought, let's just drive it. And then I can stop at the gym along the way and get in a workout. And so that worked out really. And then I had a car there. So that worked out really great. But yeah, the conference was great. I can't wait to talk at least with you two about some of the lessons there.
That's great. And Adrian, let's start with you then about what we've got going on. Well, actually, before we start on that, I don't think we mentioned this, but Adrian, you just had an engagement party.
Yeah, I was actually, like Erik, I was taking a trip too. It was about 2 weeks ago. I flew up to Maine. It was a lot of fun. First time flying in 2 years. The planes aren't bigger, so my knees were jammed up in the seat in front of me. So I didn't really enjoy that, but other than that, it was a lot of fun. My brother was up there too, so that was a lot of fun. Him getting to spend some time with me at the engagement party. It was definitely a lot of fun, but a little bit of a bummer that we had a 7 a.m. flight the next day, so it kind of just felt like just like a long 24 hours. But it was a lot of fun. It's always good time headed up to Maine, and I also got to go by the ocean. That's always like one thing I always have to check off on my list during the summer. Just go to the beach or go to the ocean. I think that kind of correlates a little well with this episode, with some like the research I was doing with places to retire. Always some like the top things people look for when they're retiring is depending on what their hobbies, but a common thing is just being by the water, and that's, I guess, something that I'll probably be looking forward to when I retire. Just being somewhere close to the water, honestly. If I could think of like my ideal place, if I were retire, would be somewhere kind of where I have like a lot of space, but also somewhere pretty close to like the city. I kind of like having the best of both worlds, where I like sleep and put my head down at night somewhere spacious, kind of rural, have a lot of space near the mountains, but also have that like 30-minute drive into the city where I get to, visit different like locations and stuff. And if it's also by the beach, I pretty much found my little safe haven, I guess.
So actually, since you've jumped into it, first, congratulations again on the engagement and the party. But since you jumped into it, what did you do? What did you look for? So you're starting this search, and what I think might be interesting, Erik, I know you took a different angle, but you're actually in the home you plan to retire in. Your move last year put you in that area. Is that correct? So
Right.
I'd
Yep.
love your insight, because as I said at the beginning, this was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be, and even though it was hypothetical. So Adrian, let's start with you're searching. You're in your 20s thinking about where you're going to retire in 40 years. What's the search look like? Where did you start?
I just started for places. One was just, I guess it does boil down to the individual. But I was just looking at places that had like a strong sense of community, had a bunch of like places of attraction, kind of had the best of both worlds. Like, for example, if you like being by the water, it's a short drive to the water. If you're like hiking, it's close to the mountain. I think those were all things I looked into. And I think one thing I did research that probably you and Eric really didn't look into was infrastructure. I found this list of like the states ranking from like the best infrastructure to the worst infrastructure. And there are some states that go almost like a full day, like 24 hours, not all at once, but throughout the year without power. And to me, someone that's 20 years old, that's a big thing. Always being connected to the Wi-Fi, always having electricity. If the power goes out for like 30 minutes, I'm like running around in circles like it's the end of the world. Kind of experienced that a little bit last night with the bad weather, but that was also something I thought was pretty interesting, I guess, as time goes on. Always being able to, turn on my TV or always be connected, I think is something that's important as well that I looked into as well. I thought that was pretty cool.
So where did you find?
So I guess I go with like my number one area. I guess this isn't a specific area, and this is pretty general, and you're going to say I'm biased, but it's the DMV area. Eric, do you know what that is? Does that ring a bell?
Around the Department of Motor Vehicles? That sounds really, really classy.
Only in Maryland.
Roshan, you can help out Eric, I guess. You can help him out.
Yeah, that's DC, Maryland, and Virginia.
And that pretty much checked off all the boxes I said. Like there's, you can go hiking. It's close to the water. Infrastructure is strong, so the power doesn't go out, which I love. Like I said, got to always be connected to the Wi-Fi. It says it's like a good place if you're retired, just trying to make new connections, a big, strong sense of community. You pretty much can find everything here. So that's what was the first thing on my list, where it kind of pretty much checked off all the boxes. I thought that was a good area. If you're not from the DMV area, just kind of look to see what they have. And I'm pretty sure has everything, if not most of the stuff that you probably look for. I think was one of the, again, I'm biased because I've been in the DMV area my whole life. So that was the first one that I had to put on my list.
All right. So Adrian, first I will tell you, you're pretty boring to pick your own neighborhood. And second, I will say, that was on my list as well. So Adrian, you were looking for infrastructure close to the water, and what was the other criteria you had on your list?
The big thing is like places where, and I guess this is different for everybody, where you could just make like connections or something. The DMV area, even though it's got like a couple cities and it can be rural, depending on where you are, it ranks up there when it comes to just, joining or meeting people or joining organizations or going to places. It's kind of got a lot. It's pretty busy where you can kind of make those connections if you want to like meet people when you retire or join different groups. It's pretty much got a lot there that I thought that was interesting. And it's, it's also part of DC as well. And that's, its own history museum if you're into that as well. It's just got a bunch of different attractions. So it's, like I said, it kind of checked off a lot of stuff on my list. So it kind of made an easy one to add. I thought that was interesting as well. But yeah, Roshan, I know I'm a little bit boring. I know I'm a little bit biased here, but for someone that's lived here their whole life, you can't really blame me for putting that up on my list.
No, not at all. I thought it was funny because the local area came up on my list as well. It was actually a little more specific to Virginia, but I'll talk about my criteria. And Eric, yours seems to be the most interesting because you took a little bit of a different approach. So we'll go over yours last. Mm-hmm. But being frugal as I am, I looked for the lowest taxes first. So the thing on my list was lowest overall taxes and lowest taxes. And
Yeah.
I also was looking at close to the water, so I was looking at beaches and the climate a little bit, and my list narrowed down to Delaware, Florida, and Virginia. So those were the three that came up. What's interesting and there are a ton of great resources out there. So there's Market Watch has a "Where should I retire?" questionnaire, and I felt almost a little unqualified to make these choices because they had so many different things you could select that I hadn't really thought about. So we will share the link, but the questions they have include categories of who lives there as far as seniors, college grads, religion, population, political leanings, money, July weather and January weather, snowfall, climate, health, transportation, activities, culture, and then they have other fun stuff. So those are their categories. You can pick up to 5 must-haves and up to 5 nice-to-haves. I only had 2 things on the list. One was low overall taxes. 2 was near the beach, and then because they required you to pick a nice to have, I went in and just picked July temperatures around the 80s, just thinking it won't get too hot. And the list came back with Florida, Georgia, and Texas. The other list that I found with taxes was where I came up with Delaware, and I was surprised to see 1, Virginia on the list from a low tax perspective and a low overall tax perspective, and 2, the other surprise for me was Maryland was ranked amongst the worst as far as the states for retirement, and being raised in Maryland and living in Virginia now, I think I was a little offended by it being one of the worst places on the list. I was definitely surprised. But what I found so difficult was I've narrowed down my list to these 3, but I couldn't actually pick one now. What was eye-opening for me is I meet so many retirees who have no idea where they want to live, and being more than 20 years from retirement, I look at that and sometimes I think, well, that's pretty exciting in the sense that you can pick anywhere and it can be an adventure to choose. Going through this process, though, I realized that could also be pretty scary, not knowing where your home's going to be, because you have so many choices, you don't know where to pick. But I was able to narrow it down to those 3. If I was retiring today and having to make that decision, I think my next step in the process would be to keep my current home and rent a place in these areas based on what I thought would be the higher probability. And for me, that would be Delaware or Virginia, just because Florida feels far. And Eric, I know with your move, it was partly family based. I was also thinking, well, I wonder where my kids will be, and in making that decision. So that'll definitely impact it. Whereas, Adrian, when I was your age, you could have put me on a plane to Florida to the beach and I wouldn't have cared about anything else. I'm like, all right, I'm retiring there, and I would have been done.
Nice. I feel that. I definitely do like the test drive theory, where if you do have your mindset on a place you want to retire, like go there, spend as long as you need to, just to see if this will be a good fit for you. But do you think there's any cons to that as well? If you're testing it out, you're not officially moved in there, you're always going to go back to where you originally are. But it's also really important for you to test it out. I think that's extremely, extremely important. So that's definitely going to be something to think about. Do you guys see any maybe drawbacks to actually testing out the area you want to live in retirement? Because I know it's kind of, let's just say, convenient if you go to that location where you're going to retire, you spend a couple weeks there in a month and you really enjoy it, but then that kind of test drives over and you go back to where you originally are. And, when you go there, I guess you have kind of this mindset of, oh, let me practice my retirement. Let me do all this. And then let's just say you do move there and it's, it's for the long term. You kind of gave up that original place you're at. Have you ever experienced that with a client, or know any stories that's very similar? Because I know it's it's really important to kind of test out where you're going to live. But then when you kind of move there and you're set in stone, you're kind of, I know you always have the flexibility where you can change it, but I was just kind of wondering if you guys heard it or recognize or seen any examples like that, or have any ideas for our listeners.
Sure. I mean, I think the test drive idea is genius. If you wind up moving someplace and then 60 days into it, you find out you hate it. That was a pretty big miss. So yeah, absolutely. Renting a place, checking it out, although you may have prior experience with it. So yeah, I completely really agree with you, Adrian.
Yeah, I actually have I don't have a client that's actually done that, keep their home and go test drive areas. I do have two clients who, while they were still working, decided to take their vacations to where they thought they wanted to retire for a few years to find where to live. One of those two, actually, I think it was her second or third year of doing it, decided that she really loved Asheville, North Carolina, and sort of never came back. This was it's probably 15 years ago that this happened. And she came back to pack up and move, but she just knew it was right after 2 weeks, and she was going to retire early. But then her work let her telecommute. She worked at a nonprofit in D.C. They didn't want her to leave, so they said, "Fine, move down there and telecommute." And 15 years ago, that wasn't that common. So she ended up working beyond how long she thought she would, because she liked where she was living. She was able to telecommute, and she felt like she had the best of both worlds. Mm-hmm. But the one risk I do see is, I can imagine it feels kind of like living out of a suitcase. Although if you did it 1 year at a time, maybe not so much of that. It just might feel a little bit unsettled if you go at it with the test drive approach. But for me, if I had to decide that now, that's probably what I would do. Let's see 20 years from now if I feel the same way. Mm-hmm. Adrian, tell us about your story, since you've gone through this. Erik, since you've gone through this, can you tell us about your story about the move? I know you've talked about it before, but if you can give us the short version of why you decided to move, how you found the place, that type of thing.
Overwhelmingly, the reason that we moved, which I think is a motivation for a lot, not all, but for a lot of people, is family. So we have a daughter that lives now only 6 minutes from us, as opposed to what had been nearly 4 hours. And our eldest daughter, while she and her husband and our grandchildren are out in Seattle, nevertheless, when they come back to the Midwest for vacations to see each of the two sides of the family, his family is just about an hour from here. So that's shortened the transit time between the two grandparents' homes for for the four of them, from 4 hours each way to about 45 minutes each way. So it just seemed to us that upon my wife's retiring, if we could get the band back together, why not?
And was it literally that simple of get closer to family? Did you look at any of these other categories I mentioned, like taxes, who lives there in terms of the type of people, political leanings, money, any of these things on this list that I
hiking
found?
Trails?
Yeah.
Well, as a matter of fact, on Thursday we're celebrating Friday is our 38th wedding anniversary. So on Thursday we're driving up to the Upper Peninsula and the Lake Superior Lakeshore. There's this area called Pictured Rocks, and precisely, Adrian, that's what we're doing. Is we're going to be scouting out, doing sort of advanced intel so that we can do a week-long backpacking trip along the Pictured Rocks National Lake Shore.
Make sure it's safe, make sure there's no wild animals, make sure the trails are easy to walk. What's kind of your criteria?
Oh, well, in this case, the criteria is because of the reaction on the state and federal level to the pandemic. It's been harder to get backcountry permits. That's one. Secondly, there's a really aggressive fly that sweeps in off of Lake Superior if there's a wind from the north, and we just want to find out from the locals whether our thought about early October works there. Otherwise, we're going to have to be waiting maybe a little bit later than early October to get to a point where it's cool enough to wear long sleeves, nets, long socks, long pants, the whole 9 yards. So Yeah, so that's what's going on there. But the main thing here was family. The secondary consideration, I have to admit, was it's a lower tax base, so that didn't hurt, or at least a lower tax on the property side, and as well as on the income side. But from a political standpoint, while Illinois is solid blue, I would say Michigan is pretty purple to blue, so it's not a lot of big difference there. Both both of the states elect predominantly blue governors and legislatures and that sort of thing. So mostly family, secondarily taxes, and it's just a beautiful area here. The lakeshore of Lake Michigan is just one resort town after the next, and so it's not a bad place to live at that level.
When I was looking at my tax list of places that are good for retirees, Michigan did come up on there as well.
Oh,
yeah,
did it?
So
yeah, well, I know. I mean, from a per dollar of home value, our property taxes have been cut in half by moving here.
Wow!
So that's can't not like that.
Yeah, that's great. So Erik, you took a different angle on this as we were planning for this. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were looking for, why you went that path, and what you discovered?
Yeah. Well, so what motivated me, first of all, we had done an episode, this has got to be, is it 9 months ago, a year ago, something like that, where we had done it about best places to retire in the U.S. And at some point I was interested to see about exploring the same question about outside the U.S. And when we say best, of course, it really entirely depends on your criteria, as we were just talking about. But for some of my clients, the question that I've been, or maybe less clients and maybe more people who have interacted with me about the possibility of becoming clients, in some cases, the math just doesn't work of serving them. And so, on the one hand, I would say we're social workers, but at the same time, we're capitalists. So we have to run businesses. And in some cases, there's just no way that we could justify charging what we typically need to run our businesses for some people whose life circumstances have left them in something of a pinch. And so what I've tried to do over time is have conversations with some of these people about if it's evident just through the process of conversation and not necessarily going deeply into a financial plan, but if it's been evident through that course of the conversation that they are really burning through their money really fast and just don't have necessarily enough of a financial background to recognize just how quickly they're depleting their resources. What I've oftentimes been focused on then is where in the US, or in a more extreme example of this, where could you live abroad where you could dramatically slash your cost of living, but still have most of, if not all of, the things that you would probably want in a retirement, with the possible exception of nearness to family members. And of course, for some people, that is the deal breaker. Although I'll say, and I've said to them, if you're living in a place that's where the cost of living is low enough, and the other aspects of that environment, such as healthcare and infrastructure, as we've talked about and so forth, are strong enough, you can afford a regular plane ticket to get back and to see family. And that's certainly true in Latin America, more so than, let's say, Europe or Asia. But so what I wanted to do for the podcast today was to focus on those locations that I thought had a pretty high quality of life, all things considered, but where you could pull it off for somewhere between $1,000 to $2,000 a month as a reasonable base cost of living. And if you wanted to go extravagant, you probably wouldn't have to go more than, let's say, in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, and still feel like you were living pretty high on the hog. So that was what was driving me: is how do we help people where they're not, so you're living in Chicago, you're living in, let's say, a $300,000 home, your property taxes are $8,000 to $10,000 a year, and you only have $75,000 left. How do you make that work on a Social Security income and really not much more? So that's what
awesome.
drove me.
And it shows how like really important it is to kind of just start creating that like list on, if you're thinking about relocating, just like what are the things, like you said, Eric, that are going to be like deal breakers where, you know, I'd like to live there, but if I don't have this, I can't live there. And like you have to like maybe line out items, some of the things that, oh, this would be nice if it was there, but if it's not, I could still manage. Just kind of like brainstorming those ideas is a great way to start to kind of see where you can end up in retirement. I think that's actually would be a really helpful exercise for some people, really just to kind of get the ball rolling on where you're going to relocate if you do in retirement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I can talk about a few of those
where
places.
Did you find?
Like.
Yes.
So let me just first point to people to a couple of resources. And one of these is because, you know, we're not the first people to have asked this question. And some of the people that we've talked with in the course of sort of initial exploratory conversations are not the first people to have said, I have some resource constraints. So believe it or not, I think the number I saw was 1 million Americans are living on a permanent basis in Mexico. Isn't that interesting? So it's, and I think it's also a really large number of Canadians as well. So there's some of these paths have been traversed before, but some of the places that rank pretty highly in the resources, one of them is the Global Citizen Solutions is one. Another is International Retirement Living, and that one they do a survey every year, and they're talking to people who are living there and are on the ground and who know it. It's not just some correspondents who are parachuting in and forming a few superficial impressions and then moving on. So, and both of these sources, as well as others, attempt to help you not just with a broad overall ranking, but allow you, just as Roshan, you indicated you did with that one tool. I think, was it on the U.S. News and World Report?
That was Market Watch.
Market Watch. Okay. Yeah. So on that website, the same thing is true here, that you can go through and say, well, this criterion is important to me, but that one is less so. And so the overall rankings that they had include the following considerations: housing, benefits, what it takes to have a visa if you're an American citizen, what's it like, or whether that's a visa or a residency permit. How does it work from fitting in, just from a cultural level? How does it work from and language as well? What's the level of development in the infrastructure there? What's the climate like? What's healthcare like? Governance? What are the opportunities, and what's the cost of living? So for International Retirement Living for 2021, they released this about a month ago. Their number one choice was Costa Rica, and then Panama, Mexico, Colombia, Portugal, Ecuador, and so forth. You can go and see their full list and all the things that they've done there. But the three places that I thought that lined up most with what I would be keen to do, again, if it eliminated the consideration of family, because then this would recreate the problem of being pretty far away from kids and grandkids. But the three places would be, in ascending order here, would be first would be Portugal. And Portugal, in part because you mentioned, all of the considerations about climate. Portugal is one of those places that has a San Diego-like climate. I spent a lot of time in San Diego, and I just hate humidity. So that just really appeals to me, that a less humid place, but one that's more consistent temperatures are year round, and not having to shovel snow or have a snowblower, that really appealed to me, as well as it's a fairly well developed part of the world, and it's reasonable in its expenses. The second place would surprise me a little bit when I dug in a little bit deeper. The second place was Ecuador. I wasn't expecting that, but Ecuador, again, you might be saying, "Oh, Eric, it sounds pretty hot. You just finished saying you hate humidity." But the nice thing about Ecuador is that you can get up to some high elevations there, and then you solve that problem. So at 8,400 feet is the town of, I think it's Cuencas, if I'm saying that correctly, and it's 300-some thousand people. It's lots of interesting architecture, mountains around, so you can do the hiking. It's a well developed place with a long history, and it's reasonable. And then my top place was really a big surprise to me. but it was in Vietnam.
Interesting.
And in Vietnam, here again, you'd say, Eric, I've seen the movies. All of the movies that were recreating the Vietnam War and what have you. It looks like it's sweltering and miserable and so forth. Here again, if you get to elevation, you can change that. And so, one of the towns in Vietnam is Dalat, and it's at about 4,500 feet. So again, you're at a much more temperate place. It's not like you're living on the coast, and also a pretty big city there too. So those are my three: Portugal, broadly speaking, and then, as I said, Ecuador,
Something
and then
that comes to
finally
mind here.
Vietnam.
There's, I guess you mentioned it too, also the health considerations as well, because I could have heard maybe like a year ago, there was this like this NFL player that couldn't play like a Denver game because like the elevations were like too high or something, so he couldn't be around it. So I guess that's also a good consideration if you're going to move somewhere hot, but there's high elevation areas. You got to see if you're physically capable of living there. Roshan, did you hear about that? I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. It was Ryan Clark, who was on the Redskins and the Steelers as well, that he had sickle cell, so he couldn't play in Denver. Eric, let me ask you a question on your list, though. You had mentioned a range of cost of living. Do you have how much it costs to live in each of those, your top three areas? It was Vietnam, Portugal, and Costa Rica.
Yeah, Portugal's is going to be closer to in that $2,000 to $3,000 a month range to live comfortably, depending, of course, on where you pick. If you're picking like Lisbon, it's going to be a different story than if you're living up in some of the smaller towns, not tiny towns, but smaller places outside the major cities. But it was in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. In Vietnam and in Ecuador, it was in that $1,000 to $2,000 range. And not that you couldn't spend up to $3,000, and you could certainly enhance. But if I'm just thinking, if somebody has, let's say, a $2,000 a month Social Security check, and that's about all they've got, with the inflation adjustments, they could make that work. And in Ecuador, by the way, they use the dollar. So you're going to be subject to the currency hedging problem. Also, I guess another consideration is Vietnam. I was talking about that. Maybe $1,000 to $2,000 a month. Actually, we just hosted friends here in was it late April, early May, who had lived in Vietnam for a couple of years, and were talking with us about how really inexpensive, ridiculously inexpensive. I think they said the place that they rented, now it wasn't palatial, but I think they were saying it was like $200 or $300 a month for the rental on their place. And restaurants were very, very inexpensive, and taxis were very inexpensive, so they didn't own a car and this sort of thing. But as it happens, lots of places in Vietnam, surprisingly, you might say the language, Eric, wouldn't that be a big barrier? But you have a lot of language education in Vietnam as well. You have a lot of expats in each of the places that I've talked about. So if the locals aren't acquainted with the language, then you'll probably find that the expats are. And then, of course, I don't know about you guys, I lived a couple years in China. This was in the mid-'80s. This was when they were still wearing blue and green Mao jackets and caps and the whole bit. And part of the joy of that was learning the language and being able to interact as best as we could and function at some sort of basic level in a very, very different language. And yeah, I think if for people who have that similar inclination to try to learn something new and expand in that way and enrich themselves, then who cares if there's a rich English language environment? You can
I'm
make
curious,
it
Eric,
work
can
over
you still
time.
speak a little Mandarin still? Are you still fluent?
一点点.
That sounds. How would
That's
you
a
say
little bit.
I'm looking to move or I'm moving? Do you know how to say that, or is that too tough?
我要从美国住在中国. I think what I just said was I'd like to go from the United States to China.
I honestly could keep you on this podcast all day with that. That's really cool. But I think an interesting concept here, and they're kind of similar, I guess, is like lifestyle and culture. Let's just say you're just relocating within the U.S. I think that's a big thing if you're moving somewhere else. Just kind of know like the lifestyle there. Like, are you moving somewhere where it can kind of be a little different than where you are, or is it going to be the same? I think that's big. And if you're if you're moving somewhere or broader international culture, I think is the biggest thing. But I did hear like the best way to learn a language is actually going there and living there. But you also want to know their customs and like everything you need to know about it. I think that's just that's very key to really enjoying the first time you moving there and really starting off on the good foot. Just knowing everything you can about it, I think is extremely important.
Well, on that topic, I will just say I think it is easy to be Pollyannish about this and to assume that the adjustment process is going to be a lot easier than it actually will. There's a significant period, I would say, for depending on how you're wired, where it might take that you enter in, and initially sometimes there's sort of the honeymoon phase, and then after the honeymoon phase is ended, you start to become sort of disillusioned and sour about the things around you, and then you find an equilibrium, and then you find contentment again, because things are unfamiliar and it's frustrating, and you can't get things done quite as easily as you were able to do in your original setting. But the key, I think, even though I was talking earlier about the abundant expat communities, and they can be helpful, I would caution people who are thinking, Eric, you know what, you're prompting me to think seriously about potentially moving abroad. Hey, if you'd like to have that conversation, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. But I would say you do yourself a favor and endeavor as much as you can, particularly in the first couple of years, to honestly avoid expats and try and instead plunge yourself into learning, exploring, recognizing the vulnerability that you have in the local culture. And honestly, if you show an earnest effort to accommodate yourself to the local culture, first of all, the locals in most cases will admire you for that and have compassion and empathy for what you're going through, and will go out of their way to help you. And especially if you're an American, because in part you defy what I think oftentimes the characteristic pattern for Americans that are in these settings, which is to kind of have a dismissive or condescending attitude, and also to kind of huddle in their enclaves of other expats. So just get, do the learning in advance, get ready, go. And of course do the test drive as we talked about. But once you've decided that you're going to pull the trigger, then I just would really strongly encourage you to embed yourself with locals. And after a couple of years, once you've recalibrated, then start seeking out more of the expats.
It's a good idea, especially if you're going to a place with a different language altogether. I think you'd learn it a lot quicker. For our Chinese listeners, please tell us if Eric actually said what he said, what he told us he said, because I have no idea. He could be making fun of us right now.
Terrible.
But guys, this was at least for me, this was a very interesting process. I did not think it would be easy, but I also didn't think it would be this difficult to figure it out. Eric, it sounds like for you in real life, it was actually relatively easy to make that decision. I have a feeling that when it comes time for me, getting the family back together, like you said, getting the band back together might be an easy way to decide this. And since Adrian's going to live in the exact same house he grew up in, we'll know where to find him.
I only moved like 40 minutes away, but I think it's interesting. I kind of wonder how much this like concept of relocating or retire has like really changed, especially like due to technology, where now, let's just say like if you miss your family, you can just pull them up on like video or something, or you're connected right away. Obviously, it's a lot different than actually physically being there, but you can't bring them in the same room with you, so to speak. Whereas let's just say like a couple decades ago, it definitely weighed a lot more just, moving close to family, because you didn't have like technology really bringing them in. So I think that's a really interesting like kind of shift in thought where people consider like relocating now, that I'm probably curious to like look more into how that really has changed, or how that will develop like over time.
Yeah, I imagine it like what you said would make me think it'd be easier, but having gone through this process, I don't know if it actually would be easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
hey guys, before we wrap up, I want to just remind our listeners that we do have our website up and running now. And so if you haven't gone yet, I would encourage you to go to the retirement, which is www.retirementlifestyleshow.com. You'll find all our past episodes there. You'll see a lineup of our most recent YouTube versions of these podcasts. You'll see other ways, other resources there, as well as our show notes for every episode. And you'll find ways to contact us. And we'd love it if you'd reach out with questions. Remember, we did the episode one or two back where it was listeners' questions. So shoot us some listeners' questions, and we'll take those up as part of our podcast.
Yeah, we're definitely here to help. So, and we also appreciate the ideas. So if you have questions, that becomes an easy show idea for us. We're happy to go over, and definitely check us out on the website. Also, tell your friends and family, give us 5 stars, like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And we are always here to help. We'll be back next week. This has been another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show.